Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. We are certainly going to be spending time looking at a number of different issues. This is our weekend edition, and so for the next 3 hours, we'll be covering a number of topics. And around the round table, we have Dr. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org. And matter of fact, some of the articles we're referring to, you can find on that website. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me on is this a slow news week?
I don't think so. Yes, you even last week we were saying we just thought that on Friday it'd be kind of a look back over the election. That'd be the end of that. And oh my goodness.
Remember, if a decade or two ago, we sometimes had to work a little bit to come up with things for the weekend review. And not anymore.
And especially from about Thanksgiving on, it really kind of slowed down. And last year it didn't. We'll see where it is this time. But let's start with the very significant news story, and that is a federal judge, has ordered the White House to return Jim Acosta's press pass. A little bit later, we're going to get to one of your colleagues, Tom Giovannetti, talking about what the Congress could do during the lame duck session. Also, some people say maybe it's not such a bad idea that Amazon went somewhere other than Texas. So we'll get into all of that. But federal judge Timothy Kelly sided with CNN today, ordering the White House to reinstate the chief White House correspondent for CNN, Jim Acosta's press pass. Now, the ruling wasn't so much on the First Amendment as it was on the Fifth Amendment, which is good, because I thought if you're going to say he has a First Amendment right to be in the press room, oh goodness, you can see where that's going to take you. The Fifth Amendment is, of course, that you should not be deprived of life, liberty, or property, or I guess in this case, a presidential press pass, without due process. Right. So what are your thoughts about this? Because this has been kind of festering over the last couple of days, and actually now almost a whole week. So any thoughts?
It's not entirely clear to me what the due process would be on this.
Yes.
Would you say to somebody, all right, you've had a warning and three warnings and you're out, you sit in the timeout chair. It's not clear what due process is, because you aren't entitled to sit in the White House press briefing room. If you and I go and say we want to sit into the press conference, we won't probably get allowed in there, and we can't claim First Amendment rights or due process rights. So that's what the judge pinned it on. I've not heard yet if the White House is going to challenge this, but it'll be interesting, because my own sense is the administration, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, is perfectly within its rights to not let certain members of the media in.
Again, CNN argued that the revocation of Acosta's credentials is only the beginning, and so that's why they got all sorts of news organizations, including Fox News, to say, well, we'll side with CNN. But let's come back to your key point. You and I have both, over the years, at different venues, have been there, whether it's CPAC. I've been to a National Republican Convention as a correspondent, and I've been at Radio Row at Values Voters Summits, and you can go through all of that. And we recognize it's a privilege. We apply. They give us a press pass. If for some reason we don't act appropriately, you're out. That's it. I could, you maybe could argue that the White House press room, well, this is the people's house or something like that. But you still have to have some kind of decorum. And I think they probably the easier way to have handled it, as we talked about last week, would just be for Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Donald Trump or whoever happens to be there just to not call on CNN at all. But nevertheless, I do believe that they are completely within their rights to determine who gets to sit in that room and who does not get to sit in that room.
As you point out, for years, I carried a USA Radio press pass, which I didn't use that often,
right,
but occasionally did.
Sure.
And you would submit your credentials to the authorizing body. If there was a conference or something, they would let you know whether or not you were approved to come in for a press pass. And so once you had to go through an approval process, and if you're going through the White House through the that process, it's a much more rigorous process to be able to do that. So it's a privilege and not a right. So I'm just a little bit surprised that this happened, but we'll see if it continues.
And that's the other part about this. The judge actually is just issuing a restraining order, so it is possible that that's the case. But he also went on to argue that he did so because he seemed that there would, on the merits, be something that could be rejected on the Fifth Amendment. Okay, maybe. But nevertheless, to file a lawsuit against Donald Trump, Sarah Sanders, the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, and even the Secret Service guy that handed him the pass and then took it away from him, I thought was overkill. And so you do have to ask a fundamental question, because once you say, well, you can't withdraw one, the next president, who could be a Democrat, might want to withdraw Fox News if they're obnoxious, or Breitbart, or something like this, and to say, nope, they can sit there and be as obnoxious as they want, but you have no recourse. I just don't think the next president's going to go along with us any more than the current president.
No, I agree. And I understand that during the Obama years, there was a time when somebody had stood up and was asked something that was considered disrespectful and kept pushing the president, and the media responded by alienating the press person who did it. This is right. Disrespect for the president. You shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
And Jim Acosta is certainly doing that as well.
Well, again, you got to think this through, especially in terms of the First Amendment. You have a First Amendment right. Well, you have First Amendment right to report on the president, but you don't have a First Amendment right to be in that room. And the example I used the other day, Dr. Matthews, was, lots of times we hear people saying, well, it's censorship because you don't have this book in the public library, or it's a censorship because you don't have this book in the school library. And I'm going, if you follow that to its logical extension, then they're censoring me from all my books that aren't in the library. See the point? I mean, that gets to a point where you have to say, look, just because you're CNN and you are as important, and in some respects, yes, you have a larger audience than, say, an internet reporter, but you don't want to go down that right of saying that there is a First Amendment right to be there, because then the next time you have a press conference, it's going to have to be in a stadium, because then anybody that's, quote, news could be there. And that's just ridiculous.
That's right. They approve who gets there. Not all media are allowed to come in there because it's a small room. It's a limited size room. Yeah. So not everybody gets in the first place.
Well, again, we weren't invited to the press room, and we are not planning to be there anytime soon. But I just thought I would give you a brief update on that as well. We come back from the break, though. One of your colleagues, actually an individual you work with every day, Tom Giovanetti, said that the Congress should use the lame duck session to take another whack at Obamacare. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm talking to somebody who is really one of the leading experts, I think, in the country on health care policy in the first place. So I wanted you to see that particular article. It's the third one we've listed on the website there. We'll get into what could or could not be done during this so-called lame duck session. Another one that a lot of people are talking about, which we may or may not get into, but everybody seems to be talking about it now, and we did interviews for weeks on the whole issue of the criminal justice reform. We've had Star Parker on the program. Mm-hmm. We've had a variety of other individuals addressing that, and I'm seeing more and more people talking about that since it passed the House, could be addressed in the Senate. But there are a few things that can be done. And, of course, one other one, which maybe we'll talk about in a week or so when we get Kelly Shackelford back, is they also wanted to try to push through as many of these judicial nominations so that you don't even have to worry about that. Although Jeff Flake
may be a hold up there.
You knew exactly where I was going with that. The man living up to his last name, and he has said some interesting things the last couple of days, so we'll get into that as well, and wants to do a couple of topics because I guess how did Gary Barrow said it, Jeff Flake is once again living up to his name. and they're talking about all sorts of issues which we will get into. So we'll see. We got a lot to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Imagine a world in which everyone followed the ethic Jesus taught about sex, marriage, and relationships. Sean McDowell asked people to consider that when he was involved in a discussion about biblical sexuality. Here's what he said. There would be no sexually transmitted diseases, no abortions, no brokenness from divorce. Every child would have a mother and father and experience the love and acceptance each parent uniquely offers. There would be no rape, no sexual abuse, no sex trafficking, pornography, and no need for a #MeToo campaign. Think of the healing and wholeness if people simply lived Jesus' life-giving words regarding human sexuality. In a recent column, he went on to add so much more. Think about it. There would be no more sexually transmitted infections like AIDS, herpes, or HPV. Of course, there'd be no rape. There wouldn't be any unwanted pregnancies. The whole culture would be better. There would be no crude or degrading sexual humor. Critics wouldn't be making fun of young people who decided to wait until marriage to have sexual relations. Marriages would be better. There would probably be a significant drop in the divorce rate. You would have fewer deadbeat dads. You would probably have fewer men leaving their wives for younger women. Of course, you can make up your own list of all the positive things that would happen if we followed the sex ethic of Jesus. God's word instructs us in behavior that will protect us from so many of the devastating sexual and social consequences of turning away from his instructions to us. Let me suggest that you use this argument the next time you hear someone argue for sexual freedom, or the next time you hear someone make fun of a young person who decided to remain a virgin until marriage. Sean McDowell has given us a powerful argument. I encourage you to use it. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition, and of course, we are so privileged to have across the table from me here, Dr. Merrill Matthews. He's with IPI.org. You can find this article we're talking about there, but also it appears in the Dallas Morning News. And Tom Giovanetti, of course, is with IPI, said that the Republican Congress should use this lame duck session to take another whack at Obamacare. After all, we have a number of individuals, both in the House and even a few in the Senate, that are not running for re-election or have been defeated or don't really have anything to gain or lose, so maybe could do what that would be the case. And, of course, in the past, you know, Dr. Matthews, that we had a lot of those votes for repeal and replace when it didn't mean anything. This time, if you passed repeal and replace, I would imagine the president might sign it. So talk about what could or couldn't be done in a lame duck.
Well, they have repealed a few taxes within Obamacare. Not much, but they have some. But what Tom Giovanetti was talking about was the medical device tax. There is a tax on medical devices. There is what's called the insurance tax. They have postponed that insurance tax repeatedly now, and so I don't think it starts until 2020, if I remember right. And what that means is insurance companies will have to pay a tax on the revenue, the premiums they take in. Right. So that's a tax that they would have to pay, but that gets passed on to individuals and higher premiums. Right. And we know we don't need any higher premiums. And then the last one is the Cadillac tax. Right. Under the legislation, And they did this as a way to try to find just additional revenue, but that has been postponed as well. But for a family, if your employer is providing health insurance that costs more than $27,500 a year, the employer has to pay a 40% tax on that. In essence, making it it means that's not going to be as tax free. The employer has to pay it. They have postponed that. The problem there is when they passed this legislation, Democrats thought $27,500 for a family was on the really high expensive side. These days, if you work for a small company with
that's right.
with people who are in their 50s or 60s, you probably have $27,500 for a family policy or more. We've already blown through that in many cases.
Well, let's look at a couple of those. One of those, as you mentioned, is the health insurance tax, which places, as he says, a direct tax on insurance premiums. So obviously that raises the cost. And he even talks about one analysis showed that the health insurance tax would cost the United States $16 billion in higher premiums. That's called sticker shock, isn't it?
It is, but here's the catch on that. Most of the people who are in Obamacare, are heavily subsidized.
Right.
Under the law, if the premiums go up, the subsidies go up.
Right.
So
then you're paying more in terms of deficits.
We're going to pay more in taxes just so we can cover, and the premiums go up, so that additional tax money goes to pay the higher premiums.
So again, so in some respects you go, okay, the premiums go up, but they really don't because our taxes go up. So
because our taxes go up, but taxes are going to pay the higher premiums that the government's doing. So the government's getting more money from the taxes, but it's having to spend it back out, hand it back out because of the higher premiums.
And again, you mentioned that medical device tax, which again, really in some respects raises the cost of life-saving technology. And also, as he points out here, kills tens of thousands of jobs, hurts innovation. And where else is there a lot of medical innovation except here in the United States?
Yeah, we're the primary leader, especially on medical devices.
Yeah.
And it's not a big tax, but it does add to the cost of things, which are oftentimes very expensive. And of course, in healthcare, as you and I have talked about, the pricing of various things, whether you're talking about drugs, hospital services, medical devices, are sort of a sham because insurance companies have gone in and negotiated discounts, and what you actually pay is going to be significantly less in most cases than what the actual retail price is, and so it's what they are able to negotiate. There's just no real consumer market there right now.
Well, and the other one, of course, as you said, is the Cadillac tax. And the Kaiser Family Foundation found that it would hit 30% of employer-provided plans by 2023, 42% by 2028. And again, these are taxes that, again, as he says, I love this, no-brainer for Republicans, which, again, sometimes seems like a redundancy. But nevertheless,
And I would argue that Kaiser's actually on the low side there because they have underestimated the rise in the premiums since this started. They never saw the huge rise in premiums that you and I were predicting and talking about 4 or 5 years ago. But so I would argue that they've actually underpriced it. In fact, I can tell you that one major company, all your people know of, right after the legislation passed in 2014, started looking at what they were going to do about this because they provide very good health insurance. And I said, it's 2014. At that time, it didn't go into effect until 2018. Yeah. And they said, but we have 5-year labor contracts.
That's right.
And we know we're going to be spending more, and we're going to have to do these contracts, so we've got to start doing this now. Large companies have been dealing with this for some time.
Well, and that's the whole point, is that, any change here affects a lot of other elements that you don't necessarily anticipate. And we've talked about this with you and all sorts of other individuals, that you have businesses that are planning, and if you have a 5-year plan, you're really wanting to know what's going to take place. And eliminating these taxes allows you to make some reasonable decisions about all sorts of insurance plans you're going to get, how much that is going to cost your company. And so there is a great opportunity to do so. Now, again, we've been in a political year, so doing any of this when you're in the midst of an election year is kind of difficult. So Tom suggests we do it now. I can't see, but that's why I'm not good at this, can't see why the Democrats would be against this, but you got to figure out what would be their attempt to try to prevent this, because lately we've been hearing during the election that, well, when you voted on the individual mandate, you then eliminated pre-existing conditions and all those kinds of things. if there were people to mount an opposition to his idea, how would you even begin to mount an opposition to lowering premiums and lowering taxes?
Well, because they're going to want as much revenue as they can get in, because they plan to go on a spending spree on other areas,
I see.
even as they cut certain things. So they want to eliminate the tax cut that we got in December 2017, and they want to start bringing in revenue for a couple of reasons. Number one, the federal debt's up to about $21 billion.
Right.
They're coming up to a spending limit here again, a debt limit in the next few months. So they're going to have to do something about that. And plus, they want to start to hand out more money in other areas, especially if they will move to a single payer system. Now, on the positive side, if they go to a single payer system, most of these taxes probably go away,
right,
because you're not going to have employer-based health insurance anymore. So you don't have to worry about that. But they're going to look for that, and I don't think they want to give Republicans a win going out. So I would be surprised if we get this, if we get much Democratic support, but Republicans may have to push it through.
Yes, and that's one of those interesting things, because you say they may not want to give the Republicans a win. That kind of gets back to something happening in the Senate right now, and that is that you have this very effective bipartisan criminal justice reform, some people call it prison reform bill, that passed the House, came to the Senate. They added some other provisions and could be passed by the Senate, and is something that's bipartisan enough that you think it might be at least something that could happen during the lame duck session. But again, if your mindset is, I don't want to give Donald Trump and the Republicans a win, maybe that one doesn't go anywhere either.
You can get a lot of bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. And one of the reasons that Kanye West became such a big fan of Donald Trump.
And Kim Kardashian, too.
And his wife, Kim Kardashian, were both supporters of that. And Donald Trump was willing to listen to them on that and move in that direction. So I've been to conferences where there were people on the left and the right, and people on the left said, I never thought I'd be at a conference with this group, but we're talking about criminal justice reform. And there's a lot of widespread support for it, including Rand Paul has been a big advocate of, Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform. You have some major conservatives out there who, Newt Gingrich has been an advocate of this. But on the left, Van Jones is the big advocate of it. So it's an interesting mix.
Doesn't come together very often, and a lot of it goes back to a couple of decades ago when you had crack cocaine just exploding in the inner city, and so we wanted to throw a lot of people in jail. As I say in my commentary, about 86% of the people that are serving for drug crimes of some sort or another are not the drug kingpins. These are, in some cases, individuals that began to sell drugs to support their habit. It separates families. It isn't effective, and it costs as much to put somebody in prison as it does to send somebody to an Ivy League school. So let's kind of rethink the system. So when you get the left and right agreeing, let's see if indeed that happens here in the next session of the United States Senate in what is called a lame duck session. So I just thought I'd put that on the table. If you got some comments, we've been talking about everything from Obamacare as well as criminal justice reform. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Come back, we've got a couple of other things. Matter of fact, we mentioned Jeff Flake. We got to mention him just for a few minutes before we talk about Amazon and a few other topics. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you're listening online, you can certainly leave a message, especially if you watch it on Facebook Live, because we have a place there for you to leave some comments. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and in the next hour, we're going to be talking about the election debacle in Florida with Jerry Newcomb. He'll join us by phone. All that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team. or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. About a half an hour, we're going to, of course, have our good friend Jerry Newcomb, who lives in Broward County, talking about what's going on there and has written an article that you can find on the website as well. But let me, for just a minute, since we have Dr. Merrill Matthews here, talk about what is happening in the Senate. We talked about, of course, the possibility of an up or down vote on this issue of criminal justice reform, but Jeff Flake, you mentioned his name, had to get to this, and this is from our good friend Gary Bauer, who said that Jeff Flake, senator, who is, of course, outgoing, was on MSNBC the other day, declared that sending troops to the border was a stunt, adding, "We don't know where the caravan is, if it makes it north, when is it going to come?" And I love Gary Bauer. He says, "Really, Senator? We're not as dumb as Senator Flake seems to think. We know exactly where the caravan is, and it's coming north, and some migrants are already at the border. I saw them crawling over the wall the other day. And the real issue," he said, "is that Flake doesn't seem to care." But now he also wants, as you may be aware of, to pass some legislation that would protect Robert Mueller, because he is convinced that the Mueller investigation is going to get pulled, or Robert Mueller is going to be canned, or whatever, and all of the rest, and then announced that he would refuse to support any Trump nominees, which included judges, until there's a vote on his legislation. So this is a difficulty because, if anything, the hope was, if Kelly Shackelford were here, of course, his daughter's getting married tomorrow, so I understand why he's not here right now. If he were here, he'd be saying, we have all these judges and all these nominees that are just waiting for an up or down vote, and a lot of that can simply take place during the lame duck session. But one senator, Jeff Flake, might have thrown a wrench in the midst of the gears. What about that?
Well, full disclosure, I've known Jeff Flake for a long time. I have not talked to him, but he used to be head of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. So
That's
he was
right.
in the think tank world, and we all hung around a little bit for some time.
I forgot about that.
I'm kind of mystified as to where he's drifted over these past few years, because I don't understand exactly what's going on there. Having said that, I think even if Mitch McConnell were able to hold together all the other Republicans that are out there,
Right.
Even if with Jeff out, if that got you 50, you've got Mike Pence who can vote for it. So we need to get those judges confirmed, even though if Jeff is able to throw a monkey wrench in this and it doesn't work, McConnell will have actually more votes coming next year.
Yes.
He'll be surrounded by a lot of other issues, so it would be nice to get these people confirmed now and on their way.
Well, again, Jeff Flake will not be replaced by Martha McSally,
Right,
but by Kirsten Sinema. So right there's a loss, but then you have a number of gains in places like Indiana and a variety of other places. And it looks like Florida, but we'll find that out in just a few minutes. So it will make the breathing room for Mitch McConnell a lot more significant, not just for the judges, although that's the primary focus, but you also got all these changes that are going to take place. It seems like every time we turn around, either Donald Trump is encouraging somebody to seek employment elsewhere, or they decide to seek employment elsewhere, and that's not surprising when you get down to it. First of all, there is a very intense White House, and if there's ever been a president that wants action quickly,
yes,
it is
indeed.
this president, right?
He is a man with an agenda, and he's a man in a hurry, and he wants to get some of these things done quickly. And Washington typically has not moved quickly. I would argue in part because that's the constitutional principle,
Yes.
to try to keep things, to have checks and balances, and try to keep things from moving too quickly. But once we come to the next session of Congress, there likely will be a number of people leaving the administration over the Christmas holidays. Some of that may be natural attrition. Some may be he's ready to try somebody else and some of the things because he wants performance. And in some cases, he doesn't feel like he's getting that performance. So Attorney General, perhaps Secretary of Homeland Security, and a few others may be up for grabs.
Yeah, UN ambassador, for example.
UN ambassador.
And, of course, we will be with an individual that has been proposed as that, and that is Michelle Bachmann. But whether she is or not, somebody's going to have to fill that role somewhere along the line.
And
so
Heather Nauert was mentioned about 2 or 3 weeks ago that it had essentially been offered to her, and the White House said it did not. Heather Nauert's another person I know from back in the 90s.
There you
go. She was a young lady then, and just getting her feet wet in the policy world, and was doing a very good job. Now she's at the State Department and maybe at the UN.
And I would think she would be another very natural one to, and probably more likely than, because the Michelle Bachmann one I actually heard about from the negative, and that is the LGBT community says we don't want her in the UN. And so I really heard it from the negative rather than the positive. So probably that was just a shot across the bow to say, don't you even think about it, Mr. President. But you did mention something in passing before we take a break. Let's get into that. We are going to have a Democratic-controlled House. Whether Nancy Pelosi is the speaker, I still think she's the odds-on favorite. But
if you're a betting person, you probably bet on her.
But it's going to be a little more contentious for sure. So that's one thing. But then you obviously have even more Republicans in the Senate. And let's just for a moment assume that Rick Scott shows up there. So you're going to have even a little more breathing room for Mitch McConnell. That tells me that, of course, we're going to have all sorts of endless investigations in the House. Men probably calling various cabinet members to account for this, that, or the other. Of course, some of those cabinet members may be gone by the time they even want to have investigations. They want to subpoena the records for Donald Trump and all the rest. But if they pass any legislation, whether it's on Obamacare, whether it's a living wage, or whether it's abolishing ICE, that comes to the Senate, and I think it's dead on arrival, don't you think?
I think most of them will be dead on arrival, which will be one of the reasons why some of the members in the House will be reluctant to take some of these votes because, for instance, on the single-payer health care system, Nancy Pelosi would like to move something like that, or you'd have several Democrats who want to move something like that through the House. They could have the votes if they could get all the Democrats on board, but some of them are a little more moderate than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they don't want to be on record as saying, I've just voted to eliminate your employer's health insurance plan.
Or eliminate ICE, abolish ICE,
eliminate
or
ICE,
living wage, or
create a universal
basic
basic income, and these kinds of things that they can't pay for. So Nancy will have a difficult time herding all these people, assuming she's going to be the speaker, and I suspect she will. But remember, Paul Ryan used to complain that the House had passed like 200 or 300 bills, and the Senate wouldn't take any of them up.
Yes.
And they got virtually no media attention in most cases in the House. They just got passed and they sat. So I suspect we'll see something like that again.
So we've had gridlock, but we're going to have even more so. Well, we mentioned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Before we talk about Amazon, because that's another one of the articles we've posted here, Amazon's corporate welfare, in which... Don't you know, when National Review says Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is right, you know you got to pay attention to that. But the other day, protesting outside of Nancy Pelosi's office.
Yes.
It has always been hard for Republicans to herd cats. I got the sense that right now it's going to be hard for Democrats, and in particular Nancy Pelosi, to herd some of the Democratic cats. What's your thoughts?
Well, she was very kind and polite to the people and offered her support for them and said, we want to do this. Ocasio-Cortez sort of did the same thing, encouraging them on. But it's going to be the left wing of the left wing and socialist wing of the Democratic Party is where the energy and the ideas are right now.
Right.
They're the ones who are willing to go out and do this, and they don't mind ruffling some feathers in order to do it. So I would have loved to have heard what Nancy Pelosi said when the microphones were not on, because I bet it had a different tone to it.
And I bet it said, if you ever want to even sit on a committee, much less ever have a chairmanship of a committee, you better just cut this out right now. Probably it was a nice way of saying it.
You see, that Sam Rayburn, when he was Speaker of the House, used to say, when a new member would come in, a Democrat, he would say, your first term, your vote is yours. After that, your vote is mine. And I know a Republican who went to Congress in the early 2000s. They were going to pass the prescription drug benefit. He was called in by the head of the House Ways and Means Committee at the time, and he said, do you see this? Yes, sir. What is this? This is H.R. 1. He said, do you know what H.R. 1 is? That's the Speaker's bill. He says, yes, the Speaker's bill passes.
That's the end of that.
That's the end of that. I just letting you know the Speaker's bill passes.
Yeah.
So there are those kinds of pressures going on behind the scenes that most people don't know about.
Yes, for those of you that are younger, Sam Rayburn, and matter of fact, those of you in the Dallas area, we even have a Rayburn tollway, but to get along, go along, right? One of the phrases that he used, and so we'll get into that. We come back from the break. I do want to talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is right about Amazon's corporate welfare. welfare. And that is, of course, the decision is to place one in kind of the New York area and the other one in the Virginia area. We'll get into the details of that in just a minute. But there have been a lot of people saying, yep, that's just fine with us. First of all, you've had some people in Texas saying, I'm not sure I want any more people that are going to vote for blue waves coming to Texas anyway. But more importantly, look what Amazon demanded. Corporate welfare is really something that this is, again, where sometimes the left and the right can also agree on some of that. And when you have the National Review saying that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is right, we want to come back and talk about that for just a minute. And then we'll get into the election there in Florida. And, of course, we'll take your phone calls as we go through the program. Let's take a break. We have a lot more on the website, pointofview.net. Don't forget to go to ipi.org. That's, of course, where Dr. Merrill Matthews and others find some great articles and make them available to you. We'll be right back.
The campaign season brought some alarming advocacy of socialist ideas. An organization called Democratic Socialists of America spawned candidates who brought a mix of progressive ideas to their primaries. Most DSA-endorsed candidates lost their primaries, but they got a hearing and pushed some others to the left. Candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a socialist poster child. She unseated a 10-term Democrat incumbent in the New York primary and went on to win a seat in Congress. She's 28. A year ago, she was waiting tables. She campaigned as a Democratic Socialist. Democratic Socialists are not a political party. Members are free to support their own mix of progressive policies, like a $15 per hour minimum wage, Medicare for all, free college, abolishing capitalism, abolishing the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, even abolishing the U.S. Senate. This comes partially from the view that capitalism spawns inequality. Washington Post columnist Robert Samuelson writes that the sanctity of American capitalism is now questioned more than at any time since World War II. World Magazine's Jamie Dean's September article is titled Socialist Seeds. She writes of the socialist ideas that are taking hold, especially among younger voters. The socialism being touted is not necessarily Venezuela-style authoritarian dictatorship. There's no push to abolish private property or for government to own the means of production. Free market economist Jay Richards says of DSA members, more often than not, what they have in mind is some pleasing idea that they usually associate with Scandinavian nations. Sure, these countries have very generous welfare benefits, which they pay for with very high taxes. In a sense, they lean socialist, but are technically free market economies. We'd still need capitalism to pay for their expensive ideas. The cost of Medicare for all is estimated at $32 trillion over 10 years. Ms. Dean warns Christians attracted to these ideas that an impulse toward compassion by compulsion can lead down a dangerous road. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again for a few more minutes as we talk about one other article we've posted on the website here, and you can find that. And as I mentioned, we'll have Jerry Newcomb with us, and we'll be looking at what's happening in Florida. This is a piece that we've posted on, I think it's the fourth article there, by Veronique de Rugy. And I haven't said that name in probably decades, but she used to be on the program with us occasionally. Maybe we need to get her back. But anyway, she quotes from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's now the representative-elect. And Still looking for a house, I understand.
They're looking for a house, can't afford one.
Can't afford one. Oh, she's just a young millennial, so, didn't have the money for it. But anyway, she tweeted, that is, our socialist candidate from New York, Amazon is a billion-dollar company. The idea that it will receive hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks at a time when our subway is crumbling and our communities need more investment, not less, is extremely concerning to residents here. Now, as a result, there have been some people that have criticized her, but Veronique, if nothing else, said, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Ocasio-Cortez is mostly correct on this matter, and her conservative critics are wrong. Handouts like this to Amazon and other prominent companies are appalling in their cronyism, pure and simple. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, I've had some people here in Texas say, I think we dodged a bullet by not getting Amazon here. And you, even though there were people trying to bring it here, look at what, in the case of New York and Virginia, and a lot of that's, of course, New York, where she was making that comment, did in order to attract Amazon to come to the New York City area.
Well, we may have dodged a bullet, but it wasn't because we weren't holding a Target sign right in front of us here in Texas. And this is a pretty common practice. I believe most, if not all, states do it at various times where they provide tax breaks for companies to move there. So Wisconsin provided, I believe, $3 billion in tax breaks over like 10 years to Foxconn, large company that moved there. Texas provided some tax breaks to Toyota in order for them to move here. Toyota has a lot of money, but we still provided the tax breaks. And so I have mixed feelings about this because you're providing a tax. If I'm a company and I get a tax cut there, moving someplace, am I going to take advantage of it? I certainly will. I'd like to know what our tax breaks were we were offering them. But Alexandria's right also that the states and cities oftentimes offer these huge tax breaks, which could be used, especially when they have challenges, and New York has a lot of challenges. Could be used to provide more services, fix the metro or the subway there in New York. And I was in New York recently. There's a lot of repair that needs to be done around New York. So I can sympathize with her on that sense because these companies or these states and cities provide huge amounts of tax breaks, and they can offset that by raising out taxes on everybody else.
Well, and again, one of the commentaries I wrote earlier in the week was based upon the very excellent column that came from a former Republican chairman in the state of California about California is unsustainable. And it just goes through that. Having grown up in California, California is not the golden state it used to be. Even when a couple of weeks ago we interviewed John Cox, who lost as the Republican nominee for governor, you realize that some of these big states like New York and California, unlike Texas, for example, have made so many investments in the wrong areas that now the infrastructure is just crumbling right before their very eyes. The roads that I used to drive on almost 50 years ago when I was working in a machine shop are the same roads that you drive on today. The water, whole area of the water board was based on the assumption that the population in the state of California be 25 million. It's about 40 million. And, of course, New York City, when these subways were put in at the turn of the last century, have only been upgraded once or twice even since then. So in some respects, even though we might not necessarily like the socialist ideas of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think she's right on in saying, what are we doing to attract these particular people to Amazon to create some jobs? In the state of Texas, I think we can say we could create as many jobs without actually bringing Amazon here, don't you think?
And right. And it becomes a feeding frenzy as the states and cities start pouring on more and more tax breaks to these various companies, which, as I said, if you're the company and you're out there and they're willing to do it, why not take it? But it it does create problems financially for the states. Excuse me. Fortunately, we're doing better right now. The states are revenue-wise because of the strong economy, so they have a little bit more freedom to be able to do that than they did. But the next recession's coming sometime. And they'll need that additional money.
Well, and that's the other issue is that right now, whether you look at the federal government, you just talked about a $21 trillion debt, national debt, and the interest on the debt is relatively low because interest rates are not high. But change this around, give me a recession, have the interest rates go up a little bit more.
As they're doing.
And you are, first of all, hurting the federal government. but I don't even want to think about what that looks like in California, Illinois, and New York, just in terms of the pension plans and even trying to balance a budget there.
And another one of her points is this is not just a mom and pop organization that you're giving a little break to.
Right.
It's one of the wealthiest companies in the world.
Right.
They make a lot of money, and its CEO is considered by many the wealthiest person in the world. And yet they're out there striving for the tax break. So it would be better, in my opinion, for New York to say we're lowering our taxes across the board and making a good low tax environment for everybody, and that would be good for companies to move there. They haven't done that yet.
Well, and again, I've traveled to New York every year because I speak either at Word of Life or Camp of the Woods, and I see ad after ad. Of course, we've seen these in Texas, too, where New York is trying to attract people into business. And I think a lot of businesses look at that and say, oh, yeah, okay, then you give us sort of a tax-free time now, but what happens?
For a limited time.
Yeah. What happens 5 years after we get that? Because then, the regulations and everything just go through the roof.
Which lets you know New York knows that businesses are attracted by low taxes.
But they don't have a choice now.
They don't have a choice now.
It's all coming out of Albany, New York. So if nothing else, this is the question that I think we should ask. We've had Alan in here a couple of times, Eric Curl and Alan West, talking about in his latest book. One of the questions is, welcome to Texas, why are you here? And it's kind of the idea that don't bring those values that caused you to leave New York, California, Illinois to come to Texas and then try to turn us into the very states that you just left. And so it's a question that really needs to be asked.
And that's actually happening around the country. Colorado used to be a red state. It is now a fairly blue state.
Right.
As people from California moved to Colorado. We've been having Californians move to Texas. Virginia used to be a red state, but I think people from Maryland and Washington, D.C. said, well, the taxes are so high here, we're going to move to Northern Virginia, turn that state blue, and then impose those high. But they do it to escape the problems of the blue states.
But then they bring those ideas there and then find them out. Again, my dad used to joke with me because we grew up in California, worked in the California Assembly, about your 90-day wonder down here. The fact he couldn't believe that you actually only had a legislative session for 90 days. Of course, it goes longer than that, but he used to make fun of it until he began to see the consequences of that and how expensive it is to actually live in California. And the number we used just the other day is one of these groups that were producing fast food restaurants concluded that when they looked at what it took to actually build and have online a restaurant in Texas, 6 weeks. What did it take in California? 2 years or longer. You've got a choice of locating some new restaurants. Where are you going to go? 6 weeks, 2 years. Pretty easy to figure that.
It is.
Not to mention, of course, the whole issue of income tax, sales tax, and everything else. But anyway, we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll move our attention for a while to Florida, since that has been on national attention. What is it, 10 days after the election? We're still trying to count votes here. So we'll see where that takes us.
Or find them.
Or find them, yes. In the trunk of a car, rental car in Fort Lauderdale Airport. Yes, we'll get into that in just a minute. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. Jerry Newcomb will be joining us in just a minute. All that coming up right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is our weekend edition, and this is an opportunity to kind of look at a number of issues in the news, as we always do. And as we've already sort of alluded to, Dr. Merrill Matthews pointed out that not exactly a slow news day. Might just mention something we'll come back to later, and that is federal judge Timothy Kelly has sided with CNN and actually ordered the White House to reinstate the press pass for Jim Acosta. We'll talk about more what that means in just a minute. But we wanted to turn our attention to Florida for just a minute, as we have on a number of occasions. I might point you to some of the articles we've posted. One by Ann Coulter about the whole issue of election recounts and kind of giving you some of the history. A piece about an affidavit that was filed where this individual said that there were Broward County election workers filling out empty ballots. And then also Democrats plan to use altered forms to fix mail-in ballots. And so those are some interesting articles. But one that I wanted to focus on for a few minutes comes from our friend Jerry Newcomb, who, of course, is the author of nearly 30 different books. Has, of course, over the years worked with D. James Kennedy, has his own radio program and the rest. But we have posted, "Are Alinskyeites trying to steal these elections?" Jerry Newcomb, you live in Broward County. Tell me, what in the world is going on down there?
I do. Well, you know, it's so funny. It's as a news event, the eyes of much of the world are on this county on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was kind of actually difficult to find the office in question. And in fact, I had a little time off this week, so my wife and I took some time just to go and see for ourselves, you know, what was going on. And just so you have the situation, you know, to understand the situation, Brenda Snipes, who is the supervisor of elections for Broward County, she has an office in a mall. It's in the back of a mall, and have police.
This is worse than I
barricades, though. There are police barricades between, you know, where the media can be, and believe me, every kind of, you know, camera is there on the one hand, and on the other hand, there were, you know, several protesters. They're all on one side of the barricades, and then there's a kind of a no man's land, and there's not several, but there's about 4 or 5 different police officers there, and there's no way you can get into the office where the recounting is going on to observe anything. So there's really no transparency. Now, maybe that's just the way it's set up. That's the first time I've actually gone there just to see it for myself. But it's just kind of scary. So I probably know as much as you do, or you probably know as much as I do, just from reading reports that people write about, you know, as far as the, you know, any of the details of what's going on in Broward itself.
Sure, but Senator Marco Rubio reminded us of something that one of our callers also did, who is in Florida. That is, you have 67 counties in the state of Florida, and 65 of them had no problem meeting the deadline, including, as I was talking with one of my callers who was in a place that was virtually devastated almost by that hurricane. And I think it was Bay County or whatever it was. And he was talking about the fact that they only had 2 or 3 precincts they could go to. But if they could actually meet those deadlines and fulfill the law, what's the problem with these other 2 counties, Broward County and Palm Beach County? And so that's why I think the attention of the nation is focused on that, to look at the Senate race, of course, the governor's race, And then I guess it was even the agricultural commissioner's race, because there just seems to be some funny business going on down there.
Yeah. Well, and right now, the governor's race, as I understand it, is settled.
Yes.
That the new governor of Florida is going to be Ron DeSantis. That he won. That all the recounting, it doesn't change the outcome of that particular election. As far as the senatorial one, which is the one where that's the most hotly contested one, there's still, I believe, about a 13,000 vote advantage as of this moment that the governor, that is Rick Scott, has against Bill Nelson. And to be honest, Scott is kind of wondering, well, why isn't Bill Nelson conceding? Because there's so many votes, it would be hard for him to catch up.
Yeah, they did a manual recount, and I think he picked up one vote, so. Now they have to do the manual recount.
That was talking about Gillum, I thought, but You're right. You're absolutely right. It's like, wow, what are they expecting? Now, what is scary, though, is the stealing, is the shenanigans, is what happened.
You live in Fort Lauderdale. Didn't they find some ballots in a rental car in the Fort Lauderdale airport, or am I missing something?
Yes. And that kind of stuff is what's the scary part, is when they'll find these boxes. And I've seen even memes they're just made up. They're just being humorous. But it's scary, where they're showing boxes of, here are the Democratic ballots. And one of the things I pointed out in my column is that those who don't believe in God, those who don't abide by basically the foundational document of our country, which is the Declaration of Independence, which says that our rights come from the Creator. He's the one that's given us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights. And if you don't believe that there is a God who will hold us accountable, then it doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't get caught. I mean, in other words, they've bought into relative morality. And Saul Alinsky is kind of, if you will, the guy that's written the book, Rules for Radicals, on people who don't believe in God, who don't want to abide by his principles. And Saul Alinsky, of course, dedicated his book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer. And by the way, in that book, Saul Alinsky actually expresses belief that he does believe in God, but he believes even more in the idea of the ends justify the means, and it doesn't matter what you do, and as long as you do the right thing, as the radical would define it. And so at the end of the day, it's kind of basically an abuse of power, because they think they're right, and therefore they can do what they want to, regardless of what God's word says. God's word says, "Thou shalt not steal," and that includes thou shalt not steal any of these elections, too.
Jerry, this is Merrill Matthews. Initially, the Democratic candidate for Governor, Gillum, had conceded the election. I believe he withdrew his concession. Now, you mentioned that the governor's race is apparently over. Has Gillum conceded now? I mean, have y'all sort of said, yes,
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay.
That Gillum has conceded again. And of course, in the case of Bill Nelson, he had conceded on the election night itself.
Yeah.
And then when he saw how close it was, and it is my understanding that by the Constitution of Florida, that if the vote gets so close, then a recount is mandated.
Right.
That's
half a percentage, something like
the
that.
law. And so that's part of what's happening here. The sad thing would be if anybody's actually abusing that law. And so my main point, though, of the column is that this, we're in a mess, partly because, there's so many people who believe that morality is relative and therefore they can do whatever they want to as long as they don't get caught. That's problem number one. But then problem number two, and I really mean this, Christians need to vote their conscience, because if more Christians voted their Christian conscience, we wouldn't have these razor-thin margins.
We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Imagine a world in which everyone followed the ethic Jesus taught about sex, marriage, and relationships. Sean McDowell asked people to consider that when he was involved in a discussion about biblical sexuality. Here's what he said. There would be no sexually transmitted diseases, no abortions, no brokenness from divorce. Every child would have a mother and father and experience the love and acceptance each parent uniquely offers. There would be no rape, no sexual abuse, no sex trafficking, pornography, and no need for a #MeToo campaign. Think of the healing and wholeness if people simply lived Jesus' life-giving words regarding human sexuality. In a recent column, he went on to add so much more. Think about it. There would be no more sexually transmitted infections like AIDS, herpes, or HPV. Of course, there'd be no rape. There wouldn't be any unwanted pregnancies. The whole culture would be better. There would be no crude or degrading sexual humor. Critics wouldn't be making fun of young people who decided to wait until marriage to have sexual relations. Marriages would be better. There would probably be a significant drop in the divorce rate. You would have fewer deadbeat dads. You would probably have fewer men leaving their wives for younger women. Of course, you can make up your own list of all the positive things that would happen if we followed the sex ethic of Jesus. God's word instructs us in behavior that will protect us from so many of the devastating sexual and social consequences of turning away from his instructions to us. Let me suggest that you use this argument the next time you hear someone argue for sexual freedom, or the next time you hear someone make fun of a young person who decided to remain a virgin until marriage. Sean McDowell has given us a powerful argument. I encourage you to use it. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, and in studio with me today, Dr. Merrill Matthews, and also, of course, by phone, we were talking with Jerry Newcomb. One of these quotes that has been attributed to Stalin, whether it's true or not, I've seen enough evidence to suggest he probably said something like this, so a lot of times people attribute to him, those who vote decide nothing, those who count the vote decide everything. And if you look up on Snopes and others, a lot of people say, yeah, we've seen enough quotes that maybe he said something like that. Whether he said it or not, Jerry, that, of course, is one of the quotes you have in there, and certainly people have been acting this way. We just looked it up. It looks like Gillum has not necessarily conceded, still hoping for some kind of legal action. For our listeners in Georgia, we have a governor's race. For our listeners in Florida, we have a governor's race. And, of course, for our national audience, we have the possibility that you could have a Republican pickup out of Florida, which would make Mitch McConnell's life a lot easier next year when you're talking about some of these judicial confirmations. So, Dr. Merrill Matthews, if nothing else, this is why our attention is focused on Florida. And I'm going to put something on the table. I don't know at this point that these individuals seriously believe that they can overturn any of that, but isn't it at least a possibility that this is maybe just a preview or a run-through for 2020? Because if the presidential election is close again, remember how close it was 20 years ago? Oh, my goodness, 537 votes elected George W. Bush over Al Gore. So it's there may be just an attempt, if nothing else, to keep this going just to see how far can we push this, because we have, as we've documented here, affidavits filled out that election workers were filling out empty ballots, Democrats had planned to use altered forms to fix some of the mail-in ballots. Dr. Matthews, maybe that's the case.
And you have both Senator Sherrod Brown and Hillary Clinton both saying if the Republican wins, they stole the vote. They stole the election, which I assume is an attempt to try to keep people roused up and agitated for at least a couple more years so that they can come back. And because especially in Florida, they want to try to make sure they need Florida to be able to win the White House. So It's so amazing to me because you go back when they had Hillary Clinton was debating Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was asked, "Will you accept the results of the election?" Well, we'll see. And Hillary Clinton just lambasted him, and then we went through 3 or 4 days of people criticizing Donald Trump because he wouldn't be willing. He didn't immediately come out and said, "I would be willing to accept the results of the election," and that's been the Democrats' MO now for 2 years.
Certainly has. And Jerry Newcomb, let me come to you because on the one hand, you have some Democrats, a high percentage, by the way, that are still convinced that somehow the Republicans won, or at least Donald Trump won because of the Russians. Mm-hmm. And then you have now Hillary Clinton saying that if this was a fair election right now, Stacey Abrams would be the governor of Georgia. And I think she's implying that maybe Gillum would also be the governor of Florida. So you have a lot of people right now that are just sort of wondering, can I even trust my elections? What do you find in there in the state of Florida right now?
Well, how does that work? I mean, honestly, if you get more votes, don't you win? It just doesn't make sense. I did hear, by the way, there was one contest, and I think it was a state representative contest in Florida, where the difference was 37 votes.
Oh, boy.
Well, 37 votes, now that's pretty close. Then maybe, certainly a recount would be needed. But when they're separated by thousands of votes, that's crazy. And then when you have the shenanigans, and by the way, why is it seems like lately the cheating is all one way. I mean, in other words, if there was anybody cheating, trying to steal a vote, what party are they from? I mean, one of the points I made in my column is these days, when a conservative wins an election, what's the extra margin they have to win by in order to come any kind of cheating factor?
When I used to play basketball, if we had a ref that wasn't calling it fairly, we just said we better win by 10 points because this ref might be worth 8 of them.
Yeah, well, but we laugh on the one hand, and on the other hand, it gets back to my overall point about the morality, because if you do believe in no morality, or you do believe that there's no God to which we're accountable, then this life is all there is, and just do whatever it takes to get the votes and so forth, and cheat your way to office if you're inclined to politics and so forth. And that's just so wrong. But I do want to say what I kind of said quickly before the break. Kirby and is it Merrill, Dr. Matthews? Mm-hmm. There's so many Christians, so many professing Christians, who, if you ask them about, abortion, or you ask them about some of the moral issues, you ask them about fiscal responsibility, God-given rights, religious liberty, etc., they would basically, say, yeah, I would believe the conservative side of things. Well, if they get out and vote their biblical conscience, we could persuade, or, we could sway virtually every single election. There's just so many of us. And we shouldn't have these razor-thin margins. So next time, or in 2020, let's mobilize as many Christians as we can to get out and vote their biblical values, and we won't have these kinds of re-election or recounting nightmares.
One of the things that you have in your column here, which I encourage people to read in its entirety, printed out and handed out to others, is a quote from D. James Kennedy, who you worked with. And he said, at one time a Christian said, "You don't really believe that Christians should get active in politics, do you?" And he said, in tongue-in-cheek, "Well, of course not. We ought to leave it to the atheist. Otherwise, we wouldn't have anything to complain about. And you really can't complain and do something, shouldn't we?" And, of course, you even have a quote from William Penn: "Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." So there is a real need for Christians to get involved here. And if nothing else, I just think anybody that has said, well, what's the difference of one vote? here in the state of Texas. I had somebody on just the other day, and he was elected in the last election by 23 votes. And tell me that he didn't count every single vote. He served in the state Texas House in that case and was elected by 23 votes. And interesting enough, this time lost by a large margin. And so you just have to wonder. And my favorite example is from our friend Penny Pullen up there, who used to serve in the Illinois legislature. Used to do broadcasts with her at Moody. And in her election, it was a tie. Never had one of those. It was a tie. Of course, there was some question about some kind of electoral malfeasance, but it was in Cook County, so we all know that, right? You know, so finally they decided that they didn't know how to resolve it. So Judge Jabarth actually tossed a coin. She lost the coin toss, and then that week on Sunday when she went back to church, she had more than a half a dozen people say, "Oh, Penny, if I'd known it was going to be that close, I would have voted for you. But I got home late and I didn't vote, or I was out of town, I didn't get an absentee ballot." And, of course, tell me one vote doesn't count. Penny Pullen would still probably be serving in the Illinois legislature for that. So,
wow. You know, Kirby, you recently interviewed me about the book American Amnesia, and one of the columns in that book is, "Does your one vote count?" And I have example after example, but if I could just give a couple of examples. In 1645, one vote gives Oliver Cromwell control over England. 1649, one vote causes Charles I of England to be executed. 1825, one vote gives John Quincy Adams the presidency. 1960, one vote per precinct gives John F. Kennedy the presidency.
Yep.
That's one vote per precinct. But, I mean, it just shows you that one vote really does matter. And if Christians get out and vote, and if for no other reason, just to be dutiful, to obey Jesus when he said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." And in this country, we, as Bill Federer likes to point out, we are the king in America. And so if you don't like the way things are going, it's up to you. It's up to we, the people, to get out and vote and make a difference.
I might just mention again, we have a link to your columns that are available at jerrynewcomb.com. And, of course, American Amnesia is a collection of those columns. And so, Jerry, thank you for joining us, one of the residents of Broward County. So go down there and see if you can clean all that stuff up.
And just so it's known, Florida is spelled Florida, not Florih. D-U-H, like duh, Florida.
Yeah,
okay, thank you, Kirby.
Thank you. We're going to take a break, and we got a lot more to cover, but let me just get any comments from some of you. We haven't opened up the phone, so let's do that. 1-800-351-1212. We have posted quite a number of pieces. The Ann Coulter piece gives you a lot of the history, some of which you might have forgotten, some of these House races, some of these Senate races. Of course, the one I've been quoting is the 2008 Norm Coleman race against Al Franken, which is interesting because Norm Coleman had 725 votes, and then they kept finding more and more votes all sorts of places, and eventually Al Franken won by 312 votes, and I think that one was stolen for sure. But then it just gives you a lot of other stories about that, and just a reminder that we need to pay attention to what's happening in our local and national elections. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews with me, and we've got a lot more to cover, but we'll take your phone calls first, right after these important messages.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife Jenny was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. MediShare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
MediShare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without MediShare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, weekend edition. And I might just mention one of the other articles is by Dr. Merrill Matthews. Outdated Medicaid rolls may tell us something about outdated voter rolls, because another problem, Dr. Matthews, which we've talked about before, is some people have been working to clean up the voter rolls.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Kobach in Kansas probably leading the way. But the Secretary of State, up until recently here in Georgia, Brian Kemp, has been doing the same. And so when you have cleaner voter rolls, that's good. And when we recognize that there's more than 200, and I forget the exact number off the top of my head now, counties, and where you already have more people on the voter rolls than you have people eligible to vote in those counties, obviously it's time to start clearing some of that up. And your piece that came out about a week ago, and it's posted on ipi.org, you've been looking at the Medicaid rolls, which are outdated, and maybe that tells us something about some of these outdated election rolls, too.
Yeah, and what sort of fostered this was the L.A. Times reporting recently that California had just done a review of its Medicaid rolls. Medicaid's the federal health insurance program for the poor. Got about 75 million Americans in that. California was looking, and they said, wait a minute, we spent about $4 billion over 3 years covering 450,000 people that are either dead, moved out, no longer qualified, got health insurance from something else. I mean, they had 450,000 names on their Medicaid rolls that were no longer qualified to be on there, and so they went to go clean those up. This struck me because I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal about 3 years ago, I think, where the state of Illinois did something similar. They went by, they had a private sector company come in and look over their Medicaid rolls, and they found over 200,000 people in Illinois that were on Medicaid rolls. Some had gotten insurance, moved out of the state, all kinds of things, and just were no longer qualified on it. But it was costing Illinois, if I remember right, about $1.4 billion a year to cover those people. And so you have to clean these rolls up, and I just can't imagine that the voter rolls are actually being maintained that much better than these Medicaid rolls, because the voter rolls don't actually cost you anything. The Medicaid rolls, most of the states have requirements that they come in with both voter rolls and Medicaid rolls and clean them up every now and then, but most of the states don't do that good a job, or at least they haven't in the past.
Well, again, Ken, maybe the public sector learned something from the private sector, because you and I have talked about before that these credit card companies have a fraud rate that's a fraction of a percent.
Fraction of a percent, right.
And we have a fraud rate in Medicare, Medicaid, voter rolls, and a variety of other things that's more than just a fraction of a percent.
Yeah,
these are phenomenal.
Federal government
things.
regularly reports that what they call the improper payments rate in Medicare and Medicaid run about 10 to 12%. And since you're looking at $500 billion for one of those programs, $600 billion, 10%, 12%, a lot of money.
And like you said, there's more incentive there for money, and if those aren't cleaned up, you can imagine what the voter rolls are like, and which is one of the reasons why I think some of you want to address this issue. So we've got a couple of phone calls here before we get to another topic. So let's stay on this whole issue of voting, and we'll go first to the state of Texas. John, thank you for joining us today. What's your point of view?
Oh, thank you very much for taking my call. I just want to give two quick examples. One in my current county where I live, where the sheriff race, I believe there was 40,000 people voted, and the race was decided literally by 55 votes out of 45,000 voters in the county.
There you go.
And this was back a couple of years ago. And my son and I were out holding up signs in one of the precincts for the sheriff that we wanted to get elected. I got into that habit a number of years ago. My son was 4 years old. We held signs for a friend of mine who was running for city council in Dallas, Texas. Say his name is no longer city council, but it's Sheffy Cadane. And the first term that he ran, he literally won, or rather he avoided a runoff, but won his election by 7 votes. Dallas is a big city. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people voting. 7 votes, and we stayed to the very, very end when the polls closed. I'll make this quick, but my son was 4, cute as a bug, And I actually had him talking to people as they walked up. Now, I counted 6 people, but a 7th person walked out of the poll and looked at me and said, I want you to know, I voted for your guy because your son was so cute. That's 7.
Here's a cute.
That
Here's
is
a
7.
Here's a lesson. There's a very good lesson there. Bring a cute kid to the poll watching.
It's
yes,
fun, but it's kind of disturbing too.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
But,
and the question on that is, though, I got involved because I knew the person. 2-part question. One, how do you get other Christians involved? Where do they start? Because voting clearly is not enough anymore. So where do people start to get involved? And then the second thing is, how do we go about starting maybe a prayer group in our church where we can begin to pray up and call up candidates within the church? I appreciate you taking the call. I'll listen off the air.
Sure. First of all, let me just mention that I actually produced a little booklet a number of months ago, which maybe we will reformat now because it was talking about making your vote count. And now what I'm going to do is talking about taking these principles and applying them. And one of the things I talk about is that in a lot of churches, they give you the permission to put together a Christian Action Committee. And if you want more information about that, for example, Focus on the Family and the family policy groups will help you with that. We have a very dynamic one at Prestonwood Baptist Church in Dallas, so I could use that as an example since you're in Texas. But these are an opportunity for you to take some like-minded individuals who maybe are activists, who want to maybe have an opportunity to pass out a voter's guide or maybe invite candidates to a forum or something like that. And lots of times pastors, as you well know, Dr. Matthews, maybe not your pastor, Tommy Nelson, but a lot of pastors are a little bit hesitant about these activist types. But to know that they've got a Christian Action Committee that's actually responsible to the elders or the deacon or to the pastor, and is then using that to educate the citizens, I've seen that those are really effective within the church, because the first thing they do is say, let's go through and find out who is not registered to vote. And there are ways that you can actually put your list of voters next to the list of your church members. And there are groups that will do that without violating your confidentiality. And it's surprising to find out lots of times, even in these evangelical churches, a lot of people are not registered to vote. So that's step number 1. Step number 2, they don't know who the candidates are. So create a candidate forum, and you can invite all the candidates. Now, maybe not all of them attend, but if you invite them all, then you give them a chance to meet some of those individuals, and especially these down ballot elections on sheriff and judge and district attorney. They never have even seen a commercial by them, so that's another thing to do. And then, of course, once you begin to identify those people, then encourage them to get out to vote. And if Penny Pullen had some of that in her particular race up there in Illinois, I still think she would have been serving in the legislature. So I just think that's another creative way to do that. And even in my little book, Make Your Vote Count, I've got a citizenship quotient that Richard Ford, you know him, actually put together, where it just helps you evaluate what kind of citizen I am. And it asks some pretty penetrating questions. Can you name your 2 senators? Can you name your representative? By the time you get down to can you name your state senator, your state representative, a lot of people kind of start rolling their eyes. Have you voted in the last couple elections? Have you prayed for some, and it gives you a sense of, how am I doing as a citizen? And you could give that as a test to everybody in the group, and it would cause them to be a little bit more motivated. And guess what? That'll have an impact on the next election.
Well, you've highlighted a number of major things. And of course, there was a time when Christian Coalition was really, back in the 1990s, it was so effective out there in Washington. If I were going by and talking to a member of Congress about some legislation, they would often say, where's the Christian Coalition on this? They wanted to know because they wanted to make sure they were going in that direction. So we have local areas, but you also have sort of a national. Now, I just don't know that anybody has really replaced the Christian Coalition, at least as effective as it was in the 90s.
No. But again, even when we had our election resources, we had a list of those family policy groups, which was on the, and I think you could still do a search and find them, but you could simply go to Focus on the Family Policy. I think it's family.org/family policy, or however you get to it. and you can see what's in your state. And then they can point you to an organization like that. They're also aware of all the other groups, whether it's American Family Association, Family Research Council, Eagle Forum, Concerned Women for America, all sorts of groups. And now's the time to get involved. Most people say, well, I'll vote and I won't pay any attention for 2 years.
Yeah, the 2020 election has already begun.
It certainly has. Got a lot more phone calls, and I will get to those, but unfortunately, I need to do what I can to give you a chance to hear one of the commercials that your local station might be playing, or one of the PSAs. And when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Did spend a little bit of time talking about what was happening in Florida. I see most of you want to talk a little bit about the importance of voting. And John, thank you for your stories. Those are incredible. 7 votes.
7 votes.
And a cute kid. That's how you got there. So we'll come back and take some more calls. Some of you have questions about voting and wonder whether or not your vote really counts. How many people voting illegally? We'll get into all those questions, and we will deal with those right after these important messages.
The campaign season brought some alarming advocacy of socialist ideas. An organization called Democratic Socialists of America spawned candidates who brought a mix of progressive ideas to their primaries. Most DSA-endorsed candidates lost their primaries, but they got a hearing and pushed some others to the left. Candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a socialist poster child. She unseated a 10-term Democrat incumbent in the New York primary and went on to win a seat in Congress. She's 28. A year ago, she was waiting tables. She campaigned as a Democratic Socialist. Democratic Socialists are not a political party. Members are free to support their own mix of progressive policies, like a $15 per hour minimum wage, Medicare for all, free college, abolishing capitalism, abolishing the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, even abolishing the U.S. Senate. This comes partially from the view that capitalism spawns inequality. Washington Post columnist Robert Samuelson writes that the sanctity of American capitalism is now questioned more than at any time since World War II. World Magazine's Jamie Dean's September article is titled Socialist Seeds. She writes of the socialist ideas that are taking hold, especially among younger voters. The socialism being touted is not necessarily Venezuela-style authoritarian dictatorship. There's no push to abolish private property or for government to own the means of production. Free market economist Jay Richards says of DSA members, more often than not, what they have in mind is some pleasing idea that they usually associate with Scandinavian nations. Sure, these countries have very generous welfare benefits, which they pay for with very high taxes. In a sense, they lean socialist, but are technically free market economies. We'd still need capitalism to pay for their expensive ideas. The cost of Medicare for all is estimated at $32 trillion over 10 years. Ms. Dean warns Christians attracted to these ideas that an impulse toward compassion by compulsion can lead down a dangerous road. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
At the moment, talking about voting. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Louisiana. Ricky, what's your point of view today?
Yes, sir. Kirby, it'd be hard to convince all the Christians that don't vote, including me, that 7 votes would count. It probably would if we would be, in other words, our 7 votes might get our Republicans elected if it wouldn't be for the 7,000 illegal votes voting against us. And it's not just 11 million illegal aliens. It's more like 20 million plus in the country. Illegal aliens don't say, hey, I'm illegal. Go ahead, government, count me as illegal. That way you get it. No, there's probably 20. The consensus is there's probably at least 20 million plus. These 28 Democrats that won the House, I can bet you every dime you got on you that they had thousands of illegals voting, and that's how they won in all those elections, with all the illegals voting. I mean, they just stacked the deck against people that legitimately try to vote. So until they make a federal U.S. photo ID, it's almost a vain pursuit to try to convince everybody that they should vote because our votes matter. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we got more than 2 cents there, and
we got nickels worth.
Yeah, we got at least that much. Now, let's first of all be honest. For our listeners in California, they know that those who are here illegally can vote in some of the local elections.
Yes, they can.
Theoretically, they're not supposed to vote in statewide or federal elections, but we all know that there's some electoral malfeasance taking place, and if there's never been a better argument for a photo ID, which is based on whether or not you're a citizen or not, that would certainly be a case. What have you found out?
And most of the states require photo IDs these days. So it's I think it is harder than people want to try to imagine. It is harder to do that because you'd have to have complacency. You'd have to have the voting judges there who have to sign you in and so forth. Usually there's a Republican and a Democrat there, sometimes some independent poll watchers. They would have to be complicit in sort of looking past that. So, and there are fake IDs out there.
There sure are.
But there's just has been, when they try to prosecute this, signing people up has been an issue. Mail-in ballots have been an issue.
I would say especially,
as they try to go through and get people, but those are sometimes people who've actually exist who are legal that they're trying to get their votes in. But the number of cases actually prosecuted on illegal votes has been relatively small and would not typically change any election. Of course, that's the ones we catch. How many are there out there that we don't catch? But most of them seem to be fairly small incidents of it.
You know, one of the individuals that has really been on the front of this and forefront of it is John Fund, and he wrote a book years ago called Stealing Elections, and then he updated it a number of years ago, kind of Stealing Elections Part 2, or the son of Stealing Elections, or whatever you want to call it. I think he needs a Part 3 because it gets back to one of the other comments that somebody made, and I guess it was Jerry Newcomb made it, and that is when I would go through his book, I mean, he was trying to be pretty fair. Every once in a while, you do find a Republican that has been prosecuted for voter fraud, but I've, over the last couple of months, every time I saw an example of voter fraud, have brought it to people's attention, if for no other reason, to set aside this idea that there's no voter fraud.
Right. And we've had the issue raised here in the Dallas area recently from Fort Worth with some allegations of voter fraud and people arrested, I believe.
Right.
It is my understanding from people who've looked at this that it tends to be a bigger problem in off-year elections or in separate elections, not necessarily the main one, where you have smaller percentages of people coming out, and then, say, for instance, for city council or things of that nature, that it's easier to try to get some small numbers that could have a major impact in there. Because, you know, even here, as we're talking about with Rick Scott down there, 13,000 votes difference? I mean, you'd have to have a lot more to be able to make a difference there.
Well, again, you mentioned this area where we're broadcasting from. We had State Senator Don Huffines on, and he had discovered the number of people who were illegally voting in elections. And what was happening is they were actually surfacing them by self-reporting, because when you go and are called to jury duty, you can check a box and say, well, I am not a citizen. And when they would check and say, I'm not a citizen, they go, but you voted in the last election. They had one person that has been voting in elections since 1980. Now, whether they did this out of some deliberate attempt to mislead people or simply did not know, they were surfacing some of those. So, again, it's back to those voter rolls. You know, let's get the voter rolls cleaned up. Let's have voter ID. Every time you do that, though, we're accused of voter suppression.
That's
and all
exactly
that kind
right.
of stuff.
And it'll be even worse now.
Oh, don't you know?
The more you try to go and clean up these rolls, and most states actually require the state legislature, like the Secretary of State or something, to clean up these rolls on a periodic basis. In Georgia, I believe they're required to do it, but they have to do it in an off year, not an election year. So they were doing it last year, but not this year. But that hasn't that fact hasn't helped with the Brian Kemp's claim that he did not do anything untoward in the election.
Well, and of course, for our listeners in Ohio, you had a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court where they honestly said that, look, we have the Voter Rights Act and we have the motor voter law and all the rest, but it says that if we can't ever hear from you, if you have not voted in the last 3 elections and we have sent you numerous notifications saying, are you still there, and you don't respond, then we can pull you off the voter rolls. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court and ruled in favor of the state of Ohio.
Right.
So maybe we're getting there, but we've got a lot more phone calls, so let's take some. We'll go to the state of Texas. Monica, what would you like to share with us today?
Hi, Kirby. Well, just really briefly, the gentleman that called John a little bit ago, that's my husband. I didn't know he was calling, and our cute little 4-year-old.
It's a family show.
I was going to say, so yeah, we are really a point of view family. AFR all the way, all around our family. But cute little 4-year-old is now a 14-year-old, but he's still cute. But anyway, my point, along with your guest today, and that previous PSA, I didn't catch the person's name, but she was talking about the Democratic Socialist Party and their movements, and the woman that got elected in New York and all. But I agree wholeheartedly that too many Christians are just so apathetic, and I think to myself how our founding fathers would respond, and the early citizens in our nation, when after having won a revolution over a foreign monarchy and despotism, the privilege, what a privilege it is to vote. And I think way too many of us really just take that for granted. And I can't imagine anybody from a country like Russia or Syria that have these, rigged and faked elections where people supposedly get to vote, but there's just one candidate and everybody knows what the vote's going to be, how they must look at us and people that choose not to vote here or can't be bothered as, they would probably nearly give their lives to be able to live in a country like ours and have that privilege. And many people have done that in the past so that we can have that privilege. And I just think too many of us really take it for granted until it starts to look like it's, maybe too late. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think it's really alarming that some of these socialist groups and their suggestions to do away with the Constitution, to do away with the Electoral College, and some of these things, if Christians don't get involved and don't quit being apathetic and don't quit saying, well, who am I to judge, and, various kinds of things, then it will go that way, and we will lose that privilege. And that's just, that's just kind of the way that it is, that could be the outcome. I would just hate that, but I think way too many of us don't study civics. They study social studies. So we do study civics, and I appreciate your previous suggestions. I think those are all great, and it's now is the time for us to be mobilizing these groups in our churches to get ready for the next election. So I think your suggestions are great, and I really, really appreciate your guests, and I really appreciate point of view. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a break. Some of you would still like to make some other comments. We will give you that opportunity. We need to take a break. We'll come back with more with Dr. Merrill Matthews right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. It is Weekend Edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us still. We still have a number of calls, and we were talking about voting the last hour because we had Jerry Newcomb on and his piece, Are Alinskyeites Trying to Steal This Election? Also, I might point you to a piece that we mentioned earlier by Dr. Merrill Matthews dealing with some of the problems of just cleaning up the rolls for Medicare, Medicaid fraud, all those kinds of things we've talked about before. We also have posted a piece by Ann Coulter, which I think gives you kind of a summary of some of the stolen elections, or at least the elections where there were voter irregularities. Mm-hmm. Is that a good way to say it? We've also posted one about an affidavit showing that a Broward County election worker was seeing empty ballots being filled out. Another one about Democrats where we're going to use some altered forms to fix mail-in ballots. So there's just a lot of questions surrounding Florida. Whether it will change the outcome, I don't think that it will, but you wonder if there's maybe a run-through, considering that there may be other close elections in the future. Because, back in 2000, a very close election in Florida, and 2020 could have another close election where Florida determines who is the next president. So we'll see. Let's head out to California, though. KYCC. Gilbert, I think you have some things you would like to share with us about some of the voting requirements.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, so I had a concern. My wife has worked in the voting polls the last two elections, and on this last previous election, I had asked her are they allowed to ask for identification to verify whether the person there to vote is actually registered and who they say they are. And she stated to me that they were not allowed to ask for identification from anyone there who is there to vote. If they simply have a name, and that name and I believe maybe an address matches the registration list that they have, then they allow that person to vote. And to me, that really seems like it opens up a really big door for voter fraud. I wanted to pass that on to you both, and then also along with that, my concern would be this: is that recently Governor Jerry Brown allowed non-documented peoples to obtain a California driver's licenses.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Could they be using those to register to vote?
Well, it certainly could be, and that was a concern that some people have had about that. Let me take a couple of issues simultaneously, because you got two. First of all, just because a person says that's who I am doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. And a classic illustration is we've had James O'Keefe on here. He does these videos.
Right.
And he did this video of this young kid. He was 20-something. And he goes into a polling place in Washington, D.C. and says, "My name is Eric Holder." Mm-hmm. And they're ready to hand him the... now, for anybody who does not know, Eric Holder is, 30 years older, African-American, tall. Obviously, this young kid is not Eric Holder, and at the time was the Attorney General.
And at the time, he's Attorney General of the United States.
And they were ready to hand him a ballot and vote for Eric Holder, which shows you, first of all, Gilbert, how easy it is It doesn't mean it happens all the time, but how easy it is for individuals to go in and vote for somebody else. Now,
in certain areas.
In certain areas. Now, has that happened? Yes, I saw a story the other day about an individual that came in and said, well, you've already voted. No, I haven't. Here's my voter's card. Well, you just voted. And so what they did was they invalidated I don't know how they could have even done that. But so it does occasionally happen. And so, Gilbert, you're really on target with the first issue. That is, because we don't require, in some cases, a photo ID, and because sometimes the check isn't as effective in certain states as it could be, that's at least a possibility. And there's just too much possibility for any kind of funny business. So that's the first issue. The second one, I think, is even more of concern, and that is if indeed people that are here illegally and are not citizens can get a driver's license. And since you have what's called the motor voter law, which means that when you go in and get a license, you could also register to vote, or you could come in later on and say, I want to register to vote. I think there's just too much potential for mischief.
And, of course, one of the things we've been finding lately is the mail-in ballots have been an issue where people have been either stuffing them into people's boxes or going and collecting them out of people's boxes, filling them out, and then mailing them in, or going by with somebody who's, say, a senior and maybe not as sharp as he or she used to be, and helping them by just filling out the points and then mailing it in. And some states are even going to online voting.
Yes.
And so we've opened up a door for other potential problems that would be fraud, not what we usually think of as somebody going into the polls and voting that day, but other ways they could do that.
You think we might need to get John Fund and Hans von Spaskowski on and a few others to talk about this? I'm thinking we do. Gilbert, I really appreciate your comments. And just because I want to keep moving, I'm going to go to another caller here in North Carolina. And Sherry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kirby. Thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to encourage, especially Christian listeners, to not only to vote, but to get, more involved and to speak up for what they think is right. I've noticed a lot of Christians think it's wrong to voice their opinion when it's concerning politics.
Right. Because a lot of people saying, well, if I vote, voice that I'm going to vote for somebody, people are going to criticize me and everything. And I think, some of our liberal progressive friends are quite verbal about who they're going to vote for. And I think sometimes conservative and Christians kind of just, I just won't say anything.
And that seems to be a bigger problem today than it used to be because there are so many people. I've seen polls of people who said, I simply just won't say something online, on Facebook or something of that nature because the criticism is so rampant and vicious.
Right. Well, and, we've been ruled by political correctness for so long that people are afraid to speak up about much of anything. And to me, I think that's what caused a lot of the problems we're having right now.
Yeah.
Because people are afraid to be honest.
Well, it's also why some of these polls aren't very accurate. If people call you up and say, are you going to vote for Donald Trump? I go, I'm probably going to, but I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to say I'm undecided. And I sort of wondered if that same thing was happening in, for example, the state of Texas with Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke and some others just saying, I'm not going to. You have an election that just took place in which Senator Ted Cruz won over Representative O'Rourke. But if you go anywhere in the state, you saw lots of Beto signs.
Yes, you did.
And so, like I said before, if signs elect you, then he's the next senator. But there are just a lot of people that I just think weren't going to put a Ted Cruz sign in their yard. And so they just didn't want to deal with the hassle. So, Sherry, you got a very good point. If nothing else, sometimes we are really missing opportunities because we're not vocal about our faith, not vocal about our Christian convictions. And so I certainly appreciate your comments. And that generated a whole lot of phone calls, but we got to take a break. So we'll come back and take some more phone calls. Some of you want to address that issue. And a little bit later, we're going to get into some other topics on the table. We'll get to those right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Imagine a world in which everyone followed the ethic Jesus taught about sex, marriage, and relationships. Sean McDowell asked people to consider that when he was involved in a discussion about biblical sexuality. Here's what he said. There would be no sexually transmitted diseases, no abortions, no brokenness from divorce. Every child would have a mother and father and experience the love and acceptance each parent uniquely offers. There would be no rape, no sexual abuse, no sex trafficking, pornography, and no need for a #MeToo campaign. Think of the healing and wholeness if people simply lived Jesus' life-giving words regarding human sexuality. In a recent column, he went on to add so much more. Think about it. There would be no more sexually transmitted infections like AIDS, herpes, or HPV. Of course, there'd be no rape. There wouldn't be any unwanted pregnancies. The whole culture would be better. There would be no crude or degrading sexual humor. Critics wouldn't be making fun of young people who decided to wait until marriage to have sexual relations. Marriages would be better. There would probably be a significant drop in the divorce rate. You would have fewer deadbeat dads. You would probably have fewer men leaving their wives for younger women. Of course, you can make up your own list of all the positive things that would happen if we follow the sex ethic of Jesus. God's word instructs us in behavior that will protect us from so many of the devastating sexual and social consequences of turning away from his instructions to us. Let me suggest that you use this argument the next time you hear someone argue for sexual freedom, or the next time you hear someone make fun of a young person who decided to remain a virgin until marriage. Sean McDowell has given us a powerful argument. I encourage you to use it. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute after we get sort of some of these other calls on voting, there is a very good piece that one of your colleagues, Tom Giovannetti, talked about, and that is whether or not Congress could use this lame duck session to deal with some of the Obamacare issues. So I do want to talk about that, certainly, since you are an expert on this issue of health care. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is right about Amazon's corporate welfare. That comes from a writer for National Review, and when National Review says a socialist is right, it's worth getting into as well. But let's take a few more phone calls real quickly. Heading back out to California, this time KNLB. Kathy, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I know it used to be whenever you got your driver's license, and it's still that way because it's electronic, you have to give a thumbprint or a fingerprint, and then that gets registered. What if we went back to a system where you had to have a thumbprint or fingerprint, and then that's matched up with the voters? I don't know, maybe the ones that are mailed in, you do that at the post office or something, and
well, and they even talked about putting a fingerprint. Yeah, they've talked about a fingerprint even on the absentee ballots. You know, just put your
finger on an ink pad and put it on there or something like that.
Which would address a problem because so many. There's been discussions lately about people who, as they do their signatures, one of the things they're trying to do is match signatures, and they don't always match, and sometimes signatures change over time. You broke an arm, and now I'm using my left hand because I can't use my right, or just as people age, or if they they wrote their name one way at 16 or 17, and they don't write it the same way at 65. So a thumbprint would be a good help, and we know how to do this. Apple uses it on its phone.
It does. And again, there's no technological reason we could not use that as one way of dealing with that. There's just a political reason, and that is I just think that some people don't want to have real integrity in the voting booth. And, of course, you would always have a few people say, what if somebody doesn't have two hands or a hand or whatever? Well, you'd have those few options, but we have the technological ability right now, as you said, on our phone right now. You can use a thumbprint. I've used a thumbprint to get in when we used to use that on our old studio because we had a little security here and just take a thumbprint. And so there are all sorts of things that could be done. We would never put up with the kind of problems we have in voting if that had to do with our ATM machine. Mm-hmm. When I put in my ATM card or my debit card and ATM machine, I expect that it's going to accurately total what I have received from that ATM machine. They're going to take it from my account, not somebody else's account, and all those kinds of things that we expect. And I'm just hoping that especially this younger generation, which is even more technologically adept than any other generation before, the millennial generation, the iGen generation, I just wish they would stand up here and finally just say, enough is enough. You know, voting is as important as getting the right money from the right account from my ATM machine. Why can't we fix this? Some of these voting machines are so old and antiquated. It's time to fix them, don't you think?
Yeah, and what Democrats use is this is voter suppression, but it's such a weak argument since every place you go, especially in Washington, if you go into a building, you've got to show your ID, you've got to register with somebody there. They want to know who you are and that you are who you claim you are.
Yeah. Well, Kathy, I think you got a good point. Go ahead.
And then another thing, whenever you go to vote at a machine, if it's an electronic one, how come we're not doing a time and date stamp that's maybe computer generated and it's printed right on the ballot or on the
Well, we could do that. When you go to an ATM machine, you get a receipt if you want it. Again, that's one of the things that John Fund has talked about. I'm ready to go back to the paper ballots, although watching them trying to machine count every one of the paper ballots in Florida, I don't know. But again, having a paper trail would make some sense. There are just all sorts of things that can be done if we really are serious about that. And then, again, you just have to question how serious people are about that. Let's take some more phone calls. We've got quite a number, so we'll keep it going. And in Georgia, Jacob, what's your point of view for us today?
Oh, how you doing, Kirby?
I'm good.
It's good. Hey, listen, I had an incident that happened to me. I voted early, and I went into the booth to vote, and every poll worker that was working the polls that day was black. Normally, blacks vote for the Democratic Party, and they had a form that you would check to say whether you was voting for Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, or whatever. And you had to check that. And they said, well, you have to check. And I thought it was very intimidating, and it would make potential black Republicans not want to vote because the people, all that was there, was black folks, and blacks normally vote for the Democrat.
And I can understand why you would ask that in a primary. There is absolutely no reason you should ask that in the general election.
That's right, because you can split tickets. You can vote for Greg Abbott as a Republican and Beto O'Rourke as a Democrat running.
Yeah, and this is what they had going on, and so I questioned it, and I was voting for Governor Kemp, working with him, and so I informed them about it, that I don't think that should be done because it intimidates people. You know, if
certainly could.
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that we need, as Christians, we need to really stand up and vote for candidates that is about morals, number one. That's me. It's my first objective. I've judged them by whether they believe in morals. And I found this year in the Georgia governor race that about 85% of the black pastors, priests, bishops, evangelists, whatever, they fully supported a woman that believed in abortion, same-sex marriage, and everything. They went all the way to support her. And I stood out with my pro-abortion signs and don't kill babies, children are human, and not one black clergy, deacon, or anything come over to even say one thing about it. And I'm saying to all Christians, we need to get out there when these elections and things going on, and we know that those candidates is against God's moral law and for slaughtering babies in the womb. Christians need to get out of their complacency and get out there and stand.
Very good.
Because if we don't do it, no one else will.
Well said. You know, he was talking about what happens in the polls. Now, down just a little bit from where we are broadcasting right now, there was some reports of individuals showing up at one of these poll places, and they asked them if they were Republican or Democrat, and if they said, well, if I'm a Republican, they said, well, this is only a precinct where you can vote as a Democrat. and very quickly, fortunately, one or two people complained about that, and that was ended. But, you know, again, it's those little games that get played sometimes in some of these poll places. And, of course, there have been some reports, and I've read those over the years, and I wish I could document it, about the fact that when somebody come in, they would ask them if they're Republican or Democrat. And again, it was if they were Republican, they would give them a blue pen. And if they were Democrat, give them a black pen, because the rules are that anything filled out with a blue pen doesn't count. And so there have been some stories over the years of games that are played. And as Jacob points out, when you ask, are you Republican, Democrat, Independent, it could be an intimidation factor, but it also could be a way where if indeed there's any kind of shenanigans taking place, that could be the case. So,
but just to reemphasize what you had mentioned, in a primary, you go in, at least in Texas,
you have to.
And they say you're going to vote in the Republican or the Democratic primary, so you have to designate it there.
Yeah.
But in the general election, you should not be.
Yeah, shouldn't be. Jacob, appreciate that, and you got a good point. I want to get to some other phone calls, but I just have to postpone until after the break. Then we'll come back. We might, just before we end the program today, again, Dr. Merrill Matthews is with the Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org, and one of the other articles is by one of his colleagues, Tom Giovanetti, who's been on the program with us before, about what Congress could do during this lame duck session on a couple of very important taxes that are part of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act that would actually reduce your premiums and reduce your taxes. So we'll see if that's a possibility, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll take some more phone calls, though. I see some of you want to talk about voting, and it's good to mention that just before all of that is in our rear view mirror and we head on to Thanksgiving. So we'll take some more calls right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers, defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. 5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us. And quite a number of you wanted to talk about voting, so I'll certainly take those phone calls. In just a minute, we'll talk about, are there some ways maybe we can by actually having the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate reduce your premiums with some very important changes that could take place in the Affordable Care Act. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's take a few more phone calls. Let's stay on the state of Georgia for another minute on the Good News Network. And Priscilla, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, hi, Kirby. Thank you so much. I just want to quickly just say I'm not concerned. I am concerned. Thank you for going through all those voter irregularities. But my greatest concern is that when the representatives do not care enough about the black community, we're not stupid, nor we're just ignorant of some really profound facts about family planning, and certainly their families do not want abortion. But when you're ignorant of the people who are their platform is for abortion and other evil things, that's very important to get that out there.
I think so.
When you have constituents that they're representing, and they don't, and they're so afraid to go in the black community, I'm just really so annoyed about that. Are they afraid of the black folk? I mean, they're really very, very wise people. And there are people who will pay attention and say, you know what, you're right. But I just, this problem that we had last week in the election would have never happened if you get the representatives who are supposed to be representing all their constituents and going out and talking to them like you really mean it. And then this wouldn't have happened. But so you got so much, you got hostility now because we've been so entrenched in the ignorance of the Democratic Party. You just about can't say anything, but I do. I still will talk to you.
Glad you do. Yeah. Dr. Merrill Matthews, let me get your comments.
Priscilla, let me ask you this question. It was mentioned that a lot of black pastors are very pro-Democrat and in many cases actually work to get people to the polls so they can vote Democratic. And certainly they know about the abortion issue. How is it if they're evangelical black pastors, do they reconcile those? Have you ever asked one how they reconcile that to themselves?
No, they may not be evangelical. They just may not be. And but if you have your congregation, and if you have a congregation that have been talked to and their eyes have been open about the Democratic Party, they're not going to stick with that. They're going to talk to this pastor and say, are you for killing babies? So if you don't have an argument, if you don't have the truth unveil about the Democrats, when I ask people in my community, who do you think started Ku Klux Klan? And it says, it had to be Republicans. There's no. Not really.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're educated, and we're trying to educate you here, and if you can pass that on to others, because that's the point. Priscilla, first of all, one of the reasons you get ignored is because if there's one thing that a Democratic candidate can assume, it's that he or she has the black vote.
Yes.
And so as a result...
And 90%, I think.
And you're taken for granted in a way that I think is very unfortunate. Because in some respects, when the overwhelming percentage, when it's more than 90% vote, I don't even need to go into your district. I'm just using their mindset. I don't even need to go in your district. I don't even know to go into your precinct because I already know I got your vote. Except for getting a turnout, I don't even want to campaign there. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that the Democratic leadership has assumed they already have the black vote. And except for maybe a Jack Kemp or a few others, the Republican candidates assume that they've lost the black vote. Mm-hmm. And so in some respects, that's really unfortunate for the African Americans in America.
Well, that's my point. You just can't assume that. They're your constituents. You got to go in there and fight for it.
Well said.
One of the things I've really appreciated about Senator Rand Paul is he goes into areas where a lot of Republicans won't go at times, to meetings and so forth, and to speak out to those various groups. And sometimes he gets jeered a little bit, but he's willing to go out and step into these areas where don't have a lot of Republicans milling around.
Yeah. Well, Priscilla, you've got a really good point. And again, if nothing else, I appreciate the fact that you're educating some of your fellow voters about that. And I want to just give a few more of you a chance real quickly before we run out of time here today to
deal with these issues. So let's go up to the state of Maine this time, WSEW. And Steve, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hi, yes, thank you. Two real quick things. One, about the new technology that may be available and maybe make things more secure at the voting stations. I honestly, I think it's kind of funny, sadly, that technology is there, but I really don't think that there's a desire to make it that secure. I mean, there's constantly legislation coming out to show that the opposite is true.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I hate to sound skeptical, but I think that's the case. I mean, we have in the private sector all sorts of ways to make sure that your finances are secure. Why can't we use the same technology to make sure your vote is secure? But I just don't see the interest or the willingness to spend some time and money or even try to get the technology working in that direction. So I agree with you.
And up here in the Northeast, this is something that you probably wouldn't think would happen up here. I know there's been a lot of things going on down in Florida, but during a primary here, the Democratic primaries voting locations were all the normal voting locations that we always have open. And during the Republican primaries, they only had one location near me open, and it made it impossible for me to go there and vote because the lines were so long that I didn't have time during my one day to go up there and vote. So when people heard about that, and I talked to friends about that, and when they heard, they were shocked. Even my Democrat friends and they were shocked that actually took place, but it did, and it was huge, had a huge impact.
It does seem to me that might be a problem with the Republican Party there in that area of Maine. But again, that's something to pay attention to. And of course, let's look at the other side of that. I saw these videos that I'm sure all of us did, and some of them were in Georgia and other places where they would start this video and you just go by this long line of people waiting. And in one case, they didn't have the plugs or the cords necessary for the voting machines. Now, again, you can either chalk that up to a conspiracy or voter suppression, or I think it's easier to chalk it up to bureaucratic incompetence. But either way,
there's a fair amount of that going around.
And I've oftentimes said I won't necessarily say something's a conspiracy if the better answer is bureaucratic incompetence. And you all have seen that as well. Let's take one more phone call. I'm going to Alaska with Susan, but I think you want to actually tell us a story about your uncle's problems voting in North Carolina. So share that with us if you might.
Well, my uncle took time off from work on one election because he wanted to make sure the one he wanted in office, that he had a say in it. So he went to the polls, and he was told he was sorry he could not vote again, which he had not been at all, and was also informed that he had already voted that day, and he had also voted the previous 5 times, which he had not.
There you go.
So,
I'm so glad you called in, because I have started documenting some of this of people that have tried to vote, and then couldn't because somebody else stole their vote. Yeah.
May I say something else?
Please.
I would like to see, at least, I don't know if it's the same in other states, but here in Alaska, they weed out so many people. You can't vote for them during the primary. I like to vote for the best person for the job. And you either have to vote Democratic or Republican. But if there's somebody on the Democratic side or the Republican side, you can't vote for them. You have to strictly go by, their party preference.
In the primary.
I don't think well, yes, I guess, yes. But there are a lot of people that would have been the best person for the job. They were independent, but you couldn't vote for them because they weren't on your ballot.
Yeah. And you're starting to get more of those, what they call them, jungle primaries, something like that,
California has that.
Yeah.
Where you can, they take the top 2 candidates, whether it's Republican or Democrat. So Dianne Feinstein was facing an opponent was another Democrat. She won not by a huge amount, but there was some thought that she might not even win that. But in some cases, you don't want. If you're a state, you don't necessarily want people who are Democrats coming in voting for the worst Republican,
Good point.
and vice
Good
versa.
point. Yeah.
So there is some rationale behind having you vote just for the Democrat or just for the Republican.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, even though we could stay on this issue of voting, I do want to talk about this because what could Congress do during this lame duck session? Certainly, we've talked about the possibility of ratifying that criminal justice reform bill, but what could we do to deal with the whole issue of premiums for health care? So we'll be right back.
The campaign season brought some alarming advocacy of socialist ideas. An organization called Democratic Socialists of America spawned candidates who brought a mix of progressive ideas to their primaries. Most DSA-endorsed candidates lost their primaries, but they got a hearing and pushed some others to the left. Candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a socialist poster child. She unseated a 10-term Democrat incumbent in the New York primary and went on to win a seat in Congress. She's 28. A year ago, she was waiting tables. She campaigned as a Democratic Socialist. Democratic Socialists are not a political party. Members are free to support their own mix of progressive policies, like a $15 per hour minimum wage, Medicare for all, free college, abolishing capitalism, abolishing the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, even abolishing the U.S. Senate. This comes partially from the view that capitalism spawns inequality. Washington Post columnist Robert Samuelson writes that the sanctity of American capitalism is now questioned more than at any time since World War II. World Magazine's Jamie Dean's September article is titled Socialist Seeds. She writes of the socialist ideas that are taking hold, especially among younger voters. The socialism being touted is not necessarily Venezuela-style authoritarian dictatorship. There's no push to abolish private property or for government to own the means of production. Free market economist Jay Richards says of DSA members, more often than not, what they have in mind is some pleasing idea that they usually associate with Scandinavian nations. Sure, these countries have very generous welfare benefits, which they pay for with very high taxes. In a sense, they lean socialist, but are technically free market economies. We'd still need capitalism to pay for their expensive ideas. The cost of Medicare for all is estimated at $32 trillion over 10 years. Ms. Dean warns Christians attracted to these ideas that an impulse toward compassion by compulsion can lead down a dangerous road. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, we certainly have had a great discussion about voting, but I did want to, before we end the program today, point your attention to the third article we've posted here. This comes from our good friends at ipi.org. Tom Giovanetti's been on the program with you before, and I think he has done a very good job of talking about what could be done during this lame duck session. Republicans still control the House. Republicans still control the Senate. And there are a couple of votes that could actually be very significant. The health insurance tax, the medical device tax, and the Cadillac plan tax. If they were to actually deal with these, it could lower premiums and lower taxes. And that seems like a win-win. So talk about those if we can even see if that would happen.
Yes, they have. Congress has repealed some taxes in Obamacare, but not that many. Three of the major ones are the insurance tax. That's a premium. That's a tax insurers are going to have to pay on the premiums. It was supposed to start, I think, in 2018. It's been postponed. I think it is now 2020. that is supposed to start. The medical device tax has been ongoing. It is a small tax imposed on all medical devices. And then you've got the Cadillac tax. That's the tax on expensive health insurance plans. Families with whose premiums are $27,500 or more, the employer is going to have to pay, in essence, a 40% tax on amounts above that. And because health insurance premiums have exploded so much more so than Democrats promise, $27,500 for a family, which used to sound like a lot of money for a health insurance policy. In fact, it was a lot of money for a health insurance policy, is not anymore. In fact, the average family health insurance policy right now is right at $20,000. And if you're in a small company with older people, you don't have those younger people sort of offsetting the cost, you can easily be at $27,500.
So again, the health insurance tax is really a tax on insurance premiums, and of course raises the cost for families, seniors, small business, things like that. But one of the things I've heard you mention before is that it might lead to higher premiums. And one of the analysis that's in this article said it could cost America $16 billion in higher premiums by 2020 alone. But there's another catch to that. So talk about that.
Those people who are in the Obamacare exchanges, about 85% of them receive subsidies. And because of the way the law is written, when health insurance premiums go up, the federal government's contribution subsidy goes up as well. So if the government through its taxes drives up the premiums, it may be getting tax money in, but turning around and having to pay higher subsidies for those people that they're taxing.
So in one sense, the premiums could go up, but in the other sense, our taxes would go up.
Right.
And so if we do that, then our premiums don't go up, our taxes don't go up. So that's one. Let's take the second one you just mentioned in passing, because that's kind of significant, the medical device tax. Now, that could affect life-saving technology. It could affect jobs and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And again, it could even impact innovation. A lot of the innovation in medical devices takes place right here in the United States, not in other countries, right?
And we're really into a major medical device innovation period right now, where people are increasingly looking at various things for that you can use with your iPhone. I saw one here the other day where you can actually take an EKG with your iPhone. Mm-hmm. By buying a little $99 thing that you put on the iPhone. About 3 years ago, we were doing a conference in Washington, and I ran a segment called the iPhone Physical of the Future, where we had somebody come up, a student from Johns Hopkins Medical School, and he did 5 different types of tests using his iPhone and some little things that you could use to test your blood pressure and other things like that. So had guests come up, and all these things are new types of medical devices, and now there's a big fight over whether or not we don't want that considered a medical device, because then we have to pay a tax on it.
Yeah. Well, and just even in my own experience, I've got one of those scales now that ties into my phone, so it can measure just a lot more than just how much I weigh, but body fat and bone density and water and blood pressure. Well, not blood pressure, but at least heart rate. Although you have another device that does the blood pressure, it's like, I don't need a doctor anymore. I'm doing all the measurements right there with my little phone. Well, one more real quickly, and that is the Cadillac tax applies, as you said, about 40% tax on certain employers. Now, again, the Kaiser Family Foundation found that will hit about 30% of employer-provided plans by 2023. So that's still out of ways, 42% by 2028, but still, it's just a harmful tax. It seems to me that's something else that Republicans deal with.
The only reason Democrats put that in was because they needed to raise revenue for all the things that they were doing, because President Obama said it had to be balanced. They jiggled the books a little bit to call it balanced. But what they were really hoping to do was to attack CEOs' health insurance plans in. They got a lot of pushback from the labor unions, because labor unions tend to have some of the richest health insurance benefits out there. So if you're in a very rich health insurance benefit plan, or you're an older person in a small company, you're already seeing those figures right now.
So again, if you don't do this, some of the savings that people have received from the Tax Cuts and Job Act will eventually get wiped out, won't they?
Right, yeah. You would end up paying more in taxes, and so it just offsets the tax breaks that you're getting from the tax reform bill from December 2017.
So again, maybe an action item is if you wanted to contact your member of Congress in the House, it's still Republican controlled, and in the Senate, it'll even be more increase in terms of the number of Republicans. This would be a possibility of reducing both your premiums or preventing an increase in premiums at least, and preventing a tax increase if they act right now. Now, the reality is the Democrats want to take over a House in, of course, January, and they may want all of this source of income. So that's where the battle's going to be.
And they're going to try to push everything back until January. And Republicans have a lot of things on their plate if they want to try to get it done, including some appointments that need to be passed and so forth. So there's a lot for them to do in a small amount of time.
And again, as you and I have talked about before, usually about this time of year, things kind of wind down.
Yeah,
I'm not sure
they're
it is.
winding up.
Yeah, there's a possibility, as we've pointed out before, and I've done a column on this, and we've had Star Parker on here, and we've had a number of others talking about the idea that we already have passed basically a criminal justice reform or prison reform bill in the House, so it could be taken up by the Senate and passed. We also have this possibility that the House and the Senate could reduce your taxes, but we'll have to see where that goes.
And, of course, any bill that passed the House coming up to January is out. It no longer is effect. They have to reintroduce it because it's a new session of Congress come January.
Well, nothing's going to happen next week because it's Thanksgiving, but 2 weeks from now...
Well, something's going to happen next week. We're going to have Thanksgiving dinner.
But, again, whether it's the passing and the confirmation of some of these judicial nominees and a couple of other things, we'll see. But, of course, a man by the name of Jeff Flake has put some, if you will, wrenches in the gears. So we'll see where that plays out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, if nothing else, Dr. Merrill Matthews, always great to have you on the program. If you would like to know more about his organization, the Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org, this particular article is written by Tom Giovanetti, and you can find it on our website, pointofview.net, or follow the link and also find some of the other things. Matter of fact, we had this one earlier, which we talked about with Dr. Matthews about some of the need to clean up even the rolls for things like Medicare, Medicaid fraud, and all the rest. And I think we need to clean up the rolls for the election. So thank you so very much for joining us today.
Always good to be with you.
We've got a lot of things to talk about next week. I was excited about seeing some of the people we have on the program, so I hope that you will join us then as we talk about all sorts of issues. Warren Throckmorton will be with us as we talk about things like plagiarism. Jeff Myers will be talking about Summit Ministries. We're going to be talking as well about a variety of other issues in the news. For some of you local people, even Matt Krause has been talking about the new possible new Speaker of the House for the Texas House. So we just got lots to cover. But enjoy the weekend, and we'll be back here on Monday. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll see you back here on Monday.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to MediShare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. MediShare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
MediShare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without MediShare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.